Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to CTO Craft Bytes. Today we'll look at what CTOs actually need to know about data protection. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a little bit more about the group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 7,000, and CTO Craft provides them with one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. Huge thanks to our headline partner, AWS, for helping make these Bytes events possible. I'm going to be hosting for today. My name is Aleksander Korzynski. I'm the author of the upcoming book, The IT Whisperer, and I'm also the founder of DevOpsera, helping technology leaders avoid delays and disasters in their projects. Today, we are joined by Tom Gell. Tom, why don't you kick us off with an intro?
Yeah, hi everybody. So yes, I'm Tom Gell, head of data protection at TrustKey. So we help tech scale-ups with the data protection, and as you guys will know, companies these days are processing a ton of personal data, and it's so rare for the person who has it lumped on their shoulders to actually know what to do, what's actually needed, and even if they do, they rarely have the time to do it on their day job, on top of their actual day job. So yeah, we combine our platform with a dedicated expert to solve this and work with companies like Thriver and Button-Up, whose CTOs are in this community. Yeah, so I oversee delivery there, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to this chat today.
Great, thanks, Tom. So for everyone else joining us today, there's an Ask a Question button below the video. Feel free to ask questions either there or in the chat, and I'll ask them to the speaker as we go. So let's talk about what CTOs actually need to know about data protection. Tom, so why do we need data protection at all? What's the history behind it?
Yeah, it's an interesting one when you actually dive into where it comes from and kind of why it's taken seriously in certain places and less so in others. And actually, when you go back in history and look at where it first comes from, and I was warned by Aleksander to avoid naming a certain name here, so I will let you guys work out. But there was a certain totalitarian regime in Europe, in Germany, between 1933 and 1945, led by a particular guy who I'm not allowed to say. He was responsible, obviously, for some horrific things, and amongst those, there was obviously a secret police force, and they were intercepting letters and things like that, and across Europe, and that obviously had a humongous impact on people. People could be sent to their deaths as a result of it. So actually, after the war, there's this huge reaction to all of these things that happen, which leads to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's the first mention of privacy we see in law. And effectively, data protection then follows that. So when you think about it, and that's, the right to private life free of interference and all of that kind of stuff. And that's the first kind of mention of privacy. So laws then follow that and build on that. And to me, that gives a huge amount of context to why countries like the UK and the USA take it a lot less seriously than countries like Germany, France, and also, the countries of the Eastern Bloc also had, similar totalitarian regimes and are a lot more conscious about data protection than they are in the UK or the USA, which avoided totalitarian regimes for most of its history. So it gives a really interesting context when you think about it in that way, and that's what it's a reaction to, and why it exists today.
Oh dear, yeah, so it is an interesting, important context to it. So now, going to the present time, can you share a story how you helped a client that was in trouble due to insufficient data protection?
Yeah, I suppose I got kind of three quick ones to share, because I think it's important to see there's like lots of different angles that it comes in at. One was kind of the classic example where they were moving along quite nicely and suddenly came across an enterprise partner who sent them 142 questions about information security and data protection, and they suddenly realized actually, oh, it's not about the regulator and fines and the law and all those kind of things. We could actually lose business if we don't have the right things in place because these guys want to see them. So that was quite an interesting one. So we spent a good long time helping them through that questionnaire. And it was deceptive as well. It said 142 questions, but each question expanded. So there was like 3 or 4 more. So it kind of tricked you. I suppose a different angle is, we worked with a company that were very much like, we're not doing any marketing. We don't want to do marketing. We've looked at GDPR. It's too complicated. We're not going to go down that route. We're not sure. We're not going to market to existing customers or anything like that because it's too risky. And actually, when we looked at it, we were like, my goodness, you're actually you're actually missing out on like hundreds of thousands of pounds of revenue potentially here by taking it too far the other way. So we're seeing that. And I suppose the final one, I would say, we worked with a customer recently who it was actually not them, but one of their suppliers. And that's another risk you have to be kind of aware of. Their payroll provider got hacked, and they couldn't pay their staff, but they couldn't find out for 2 weeks because their payroll provider didn't have the right contact details for that company. So they suddenly realized, wait, why can't we pay our staff? Oh, our payroll provider's down. So yeah, lots of different angles that it can come in, and those are all the kind of the things that we've been helping out with and dealing with.
Got it. Yeah. Thanks. So this is very interesting. So there's the angle of losing business and marketing, and there's the angle of your data processing partners potentially having breaches and so on. So let's start with some specific advice. What are the key pieces of information that every CTO needs to know about data protection?
I guess what I would say is that it's part of everyone's job, and not necessarily all to fall on the CTO. I think we see quite often that data protection just falls on the CTO, or because it's like, oh, it's technical. All we need to do is just encrypt everything, and then everything will be fine. And it's often kind of lumped on them. Well, I would say the key thing to understand about data protection, the same thing happens to lawyers as well. In-house counsels and things like that, they just get lumped with it. Key thing to understand about data protection, I think CTOs need to understand and also kind of get this message across to the business, is it's not a technical problem, it's not a legal problem. So you can't give it a technical or a legal solution. That's not the answer. That actually data protection is a cultural problem. It's something that culturally has to be built into the business. So whilst you as a CTO will have a really important part to play in it, you should never be the sole person responsible, the sole person with this purely on your shoulders. Please just encrypt everything, and then also can you read up on all the other 99 articles of the GDPR and make sure everything's okay. It's actually something that the business needs to share, and you need to play a part of that role, and focus on the kind of cultural change rather than the technical specifics of your day job. Is what I would say is one of the kind of most important things to understand about it.
Oh, this is very interesting. So can you expand on this a little bit? So what is a healthy culture with regards to data protection, healthy culture in a company, especially in the technology department?
Basically, think about it. That's what I would say. Think about data protection when you're doing your day job. You don't have to be kind of ultra aware of every single aspect of it, but just think about some of the basics. One thing I would always say, the one tip I always give is, if you were on the other side of this, if you were a customer, would this surprise you? Would this be unexpected? Would it be? Because if so, there's probably something wrong with it. There's probably something that you're doing wrong. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to go down and be overly technical or be overly an expert. I think sometimes put yourself in the shoes of the average user. Would the average user understand this? Would this be easy to explain? Would it make sense to them? Would it make sense to you on the other side? And if you take that approach to building a new product or releasing a new update or whatever, you're largely speaking going to be on the right track. Because if it's something that people would expect, and you'd be happy justifying it and all those kind of things, I would probably say you're most of the way there. Obviously, there are some additional things to think about, but those are the kind of things that I would start with. So just think about it. Think about it in your day job when you're creating new things, when you're building new stuff, when you're updating stuff. Just think about the customer's data protection. Would they expect it? Would it be surprising to them? And all of those sorts of things. That's a really great way to start building that culture of data protection and spreading the load downwards as well, by encouraging your staff to think about it as well. Great.
This is very interesting. I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. So CTOs, one of their responsibilities is for the overall technological strategy and how it's going to change in the future. So they will be potentially in charge of choosing certain technologies for the company. Now, when a system is designed, some parts of the system may be in the cloud, in the US, in Europe, in Britain, or elsewhere in the world. So can you advise on choosing the technology providers, especially if they do process customer data? What should CTOs have in mind when choosing data processing partners?
Yeah, this is a big question. If I distill this down to some of the things you should be aware of. One kind of be aware of is it a trustworthy company? I mean, that sounds obvious from a business perspective, but also, from a personal data perspective, if it could be good. Okay, let's take a step back. One thing I would say is you could go ahead in your company and create the most compliant company in the world. You could be 100% on everything, and you give your data to a cloud provider who lose all your data or get hacked or something like that. It was kind of a waste of time, you becoming that 100% compliant, because you're in the same boat as if you didn't. Your suppliers can be your weakest link. So always double check that they are, they're sensible with data. They don't have a history of breaches. They're well renowned on the market. One of the big roles that CTOs have to play in data protection is being the expert on those technologies and understanding the kind of controls that they will have in place, understanding all the different acronyms for different kinds of encryption and stuff like that. That's one of the roles that they play. So they play a really important role in understanding whether that's a trustworthy company with the right things in place and a good understanding of things. When it comes to international transfers of data, I mean, that's complicated. It's been made complicated by court cases these days. If you're a UK-based company, generally speaking, you're fine to move data to the EU, and there's a few other adequate countries. There's only been about 13 adequacy decisions, and that means that they're fine. You're fine to share data with them without any additional measures. There's been 13, but some of them aren't that great. They're like the Faroe Islands and Jersey, so we're not talking, big important players on the market. When you're sharing data overseas, you do need to be mindful of some of the controls that the GDPR does need you to put in place. And one of them is the US. But the good news is that most big companies in the US would have already factored this in. If you're signing up a contract with Google, Google are going to give you that information. They're going to give you that contractual terms. You don't need to do it for you. But most importantly in these conversations, understand where your data is. And where it goes, because you can always justify it. You can always come back and justify it and change it. The worst thing that can happen to you on that international transfer, and like I said, it's a big topic, I'm trying to capture it in a small way, so this might not be making much sense, but the worst thing that can happen to you in that kind of international transfer sense is the ICO, the UK's data regulator, or European data regulator, could it order you, and they do have the legal power to do this, to stop doing it. So you could lose access to your data. You could have to move systems very quickly. So understand where your data goes, where it is, and what you could do if that did happen. Only if you then refused would you be talking about fines. But I think the lost business from potentially doing that is quite significant. In the same sense, if you're a cloud company based outside the UK, if you're based in America, for example, you need to be thinking about this. You can support your UK, European customers by being mindful that at any time they could have their transfer to you stopped, so you could lose their business. So also be mindful of that and do what you can to support your UK and European partners in having the correct terms in place and help them with the risk assessments. And, if you can stick a server in the UK, stick a server in the UK, stuff like that. So, do your best to support your customers as well, even if it's not technically your responsibility.
Got it. Yeah, you've opened up a lot of very interesting issues. So you mentioned contracts and the importance of contracts with data processing providers, and you mentioned those large companies already have those contracts in place. So that's mostly okay. Got it. Now you mentioned the potential risk of being cut off from your data if it's hosted elsewhere. How often does it happen?
It hasn't.
Okay.
It's happened once, and it happened to the French health service. They were ordered by the French version of the ICO, the CNIL. They were ordered to stop using Microsoft. So they had to completely shift systems. It's, again, if you're a UK business, when we say international transfers and cloud systems, we're talking about America. Let's not pretend that we're talking about other countries. We're talking about America, and that's where the big problem with international transfers comes about. With the UK, one of the priorities of the UK government is good relationships with the USA, with Washington. They're very unlikely to start pushing down this. Okay, obviously I can't guarantee it, and I'm not recommending you just go for a free for all. But they're very unlikely to kind of start cutting down on international transfers. But always remember, it's a geopolitical game as well. The EU have just been slightly upset by the US over the whole. You've got to be aware of the news. The deal to move the submarine production of Australia from France to America and the UK could have geopolitical interest. They might suddenly start cracking down on this. So for a UK perspective, UK sending data to America, yeah, it's probably unlikely they're going to be cutting down on this. The EU, on the other hand, they are a little bit more strict about these things. And so you're more likely to be caught with EU data than with UK data.
Got it. Yeah, that's very important pragmatic advice. So now, actually, let's talk a little bit more about the different laws, different regulations, different jurisdictions. Because as far as I understand, whether you're a UK company or a European company, if you target customers in a given jurisdiction, like in California, you need to follow California's data protection regulation. If you target customers in Germany, you need to follow the German regulation, even if you're based in the UK. So how can a company, especially a startup, realistically comply with all of the regulation, given that a lot of tech startups actually have global clients?
Yeah. And on top of that, they have global suppliers as well, like we're talking about, with the cloud services and things like that. The good news is that if you're based in the UK or the EU, you're already in some of the strictest data protection regulation. So you're in a good place to start with if you're complying with things going on here. However, I think probably the most sensible, pragmatic approach is what we do. And if you want me to go into any detail about any of these, I'm happy to. But we break it down into kind of 7 core pillars of data protection. And effectively, those 7 core pillars apply in any jurisdiction in the world. The good, what I'm saying, the kind of the good news about being in the strictest is there's an additional bit of good news that a lot of countries are kind of copying the GDPR. So the Brazil, the LGPD or something, they've even gone for 4-letter acronym name. They've very much copied the model of the GDPR in their data protection legislation. The CCPA in California, their data protection law is an example of what happens when you take a European law and put it into America with its lobbying and business culture. It's the GDPR that's been massively stripped down of all the things that the lobbyists were able to strip of it. So you're generally following a kind of GDPR. The world is going in a GDPR kind of way. So you can strip down data protection into these 7 principles, such as access control, having good access control, having good breach and incident management. Because a breach in Brazil is the same as a breach in the UK. You need to deal with it quickly. It's not like in Brazil you can be like, I don't need to worry about it for 6 weeks. You're still going to have to worry about it. So yeah, we got those 7 pillars: access control, breach and incident management, having good understanding of your assets and suppliers, having a good understanding of changes and backups and things like that, understanding data subject rights and things like that. So for example, in California, the right not to have your data sold; in the UK, the right to have your data deleted or the right to access your data. Risk management, because I would argue that all data protection legislation comes down to managing risk. And that includes business risk, I would say. And then additionally, the other one that I always forget about, which is governance. Good governance and a good understanding of the governance structure. Because ultimately, let's be perfectly honest, half of data protection is about doing the right thing. The other half of data protection is about proving you're doing the right thing. So having governance and things like that in place allows you to prove it. Oh yeah, we've got these people, they're responsible for X, Y, Z. We can prove it to you. Here we go. So always be mindful that a lot of data protection that we do is about proving to third parties that we do it.
Oh, this is very interesting. Let's talk about a little bit more. And by the way, thanks for these 7 points. I think this is very useful to everyone. How should you prove that you have data protection? What are the key elements of proving? What sort of documents you need to have? You mentioned certain roles you have to appoint. Can you briefly describe what it takes to be able to prove you have data protection?
I think as a kind of minimum, if you're doing something about data protection, write it down. Just write it down somewhere, store it somewhere, so that if ever you're asked to prove it, you can prove it. So if you're doing anything good around data protection, keep a note of it, keep a record of it. In terms of the policies and procedures that you need, it depends, because there's so much of data protection. The answer is it depends. Depends kind of who you're proving to, and we see that the smaller companies that have big enterprise partners, those enterprise partners expect a lot of things in place. They'll expect information security policies, acceptable use policies, and all those kinds of things. They're not necessarily mandated by the GDPR. So you need to be kind of mindful of your audience and who you're looking to prove it to. But yeah, best idea is if you're doing anything good, note it down, and also bear in mind, and this is one of the big things that we talk about, particularly with like breach and incident management. The ICO, the UK's regulator, have a massive backlog. If you have a breach or something happens or something bad happens and they report it, if someone reports it to the ICO, you might not hear it for 6 or 9 months. So you need to have some kind of record so that you can justify what you did and some kind of understanding of what you did, because you might have forgotten by then, you might have new staff by then, the person you dealt with it might have left, and that's also something to be really mindful of. The backlog in the ICO is substantial. So yeah, be mindful of that. It's
that's very useful to know. Yeah, thanks for letting us know about that. By the way, for the audience, we've now been over 20 minutes in, so feel free to ask questions. Thanks, Mark, Andrew, Noel, Lee, and Jens for participating in the chat. Noel, if you could expand on your comment a little bit, that would be great. Now, let me ask you, and this is a little, this question is going to be a little risky, but I think it's very important. Is there data protection regulation that is formally enforced, but is commonly ignored and unenforced? So CTOs don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, the GDPR.
Yes.
Yes and no. Because again, you're gonna come across this phrase a lot. It depends. It depends who we're talking about. In the UK, and this comes back to the history that I was talking about at the start. The UK's ICO, we're about to get a new one, appointed by the Department for Culture and Media and Sport. So DCMS appoint the ICO, and they've been very clear that they don't like the GDPR, and they've appointed someone who they want to take a new direction and stuff like that. So being mindful of that, I think in the UK, the ICO is more laid back than other countries. Last time I checked, and there's either only been 4 or 5 fines about GDPR in the UK in 3 years. That's not many.
Wow.
And they've one of them was for something incredibly stupid, and they just had to fine the company. But the others have largely been for a bad management of breaches and incidents. So from the GDPR perspective, it's kind of less enforced in the UK than other countries. But you have countries like Belgium, for example, fined the company who had their managing director as DPO because they said there's a conflict of interest. They can't be DPO and managing director. That's a really uber specific thing to be fining a company for. And they did. Places like Spain and Italy are very quick to fine, very quick to kind of hand out fines on some really specific things as well. So it depends on the jurisdiction. In the UK, we get an easier ride with the GDPR. What you don't get an easy ride of in the UK, however, is another law, which a lot of people forget about in data protection, which is the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations. So when you hear about, oh, you can't send messages, but you can't send emails without consent, all those kind of things, people go, oh, it's the GDPR. It's not the GDPR. It's a law from 2002. It's the PECR. It's been illegal since 2002, way before the GDPR came along. That one, the ICO fines on all the time. Every week there's a fine for cold calling, for mass email campaigns without consent, and all those kind of things. Currently, the maximum fine in that is £500,000. However, the UK is proposing to raise the maximum fine to the same level as GDPR, which is a maximum of £17.5 million, or 4% of your global turnover, whichever is higher. So there's a good chance that we'll see like digital marketing fines and things along those lines increase substantially over the next few years. So that's one to be mindful of in the UK. The UK is very anti-spam, and the regulator is very anti-spam. And so be careful on digital marketing in the UK. But yeah, it depends on the jurisdiction. It's one of those things, and each regulator has its own interests. And one thing to note, which is interesting, is they're all run by one person. You know, the Information Commissioner's Office is very much in the model currently of Elizabeth Denham. She is the Information Commissioner, it's her office. So you do get personalities come into play as well. So different personalities across Europe will have different interests, different gears to grind.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit more about the anti-spam law in the UK. What are the greatest pitfalls in that law, and what CTOs should be careful about to not breach it?
Yeah, so anything that's digital marketing in the UK, electronic marketing, and that includes text messages, automated phone calls, and I say automated because that's important. Live phone calls where you actually call someone up, you don't need consent for. They don't count. But if it's we hear you've been in a car accident, then that is against the rules. So automated phone calls, emails, cookies are covered, and that's a big one that we can talk about. By digital marketing, anything like that, you need consent before marketing electronically. There's one specific area, and it's known as the soft opt-in. And this is one you need to be mindful of. So this, if you go back to that example of that company that weren't marketing when they could have been, this is a common thing we see, people not marketing when they can be. You can market without consent to customers who gave you their details in the course or negotiations of a sale, had a chance to opt out of marketing, opt out, not in, opt out of marketing at that point and every subsequent message. And you're only marketing your own similar products and services, you don't need their consent. You can have an opt-out box. So at the checkout, for example, you can say, please don't send me marketing. A lot of people think that GDPR got rid of that. It didn't, because it's not GDPR that is worried about consent for marketing. It's PCR. GDPR isn't worried about consent for marketing. The GDPR actually says that legitimate interest, which isn't consent, is a different thing, but is a good example of something that can be used for marketing. So if you hit those three criteria, you can market to your existing or previous customers without their explicit consent. So there's a whole group of people there that a lot of companies are not marketing to. So be aware of that, but be cautious. Make sure you hit those three, because as I said, the UK are quite strict on PCR regulations. So don't start spamming people who really don't want it. And also be mindful of your brand and kind of just general customer appearance, because you might get some more complaints because of it. Because the general perception is that GDPR got rid of the opt-out box. It didn't, but a lot of people think it did, and therefore we see some complaints about it, even though they're not legitimate complaints. So yeah, think about that.
Yeah, that's good to know. Thanks for this advice. I'd like to go into the details, legal details, a little bit more. You mentioned the legal basis, and you mentioned legitimate interest, and you mentioned consent. Can you talk a little bit more about it? Because it is my understanding that there are different legal bases for processing data, and sometimes you don't need consent. You can process data on the basis of legitimate interest.
Consent should be your last option.
Okay, so I'm
going to go as far to say that, and that's probably a bit controversial, but I'm going to say the acronym is PECR, Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. So I just saw a comment in there.
Yeah.
I'd go as far as saying consent should probably be your last option, unless it's digital marketing, in which case have it. But you should still think about legitimate interest first. You see, it should always be the last thing you think about. The GDPR, so to take it back, the GDPR kind of starts off by saying you must not process personal data. That's one of the lines in the GDPR. It then has, comma, unless you have one of these reasons. And there are 6 of them. One is consent. One is legitimate interest. You've got contractual reasons, legal obligation, public task, so if you're a public authority, and vital interests. Vital interests, don't even think about it. It's for doctors. If someone's about to die and they need to do something with the data, literally it's life and death. So hopefully as a CTO, you're not going to have to worry about vital interests. Public task, again, if you're a public authority, you can rely on public task. For most people here, that's not going to be an issue, but be mindful if you work with a public sector client, you might be able to rely on public task as a processor via their legal basis. But those two, probably not going to come across very often. Legal obligation. So that's one way you have to process it. You legally have to process that information. So like an obvious example of this would be, if you're providing services to children, there's a safeguarding need. You legally have to be mindful of safeguarding. But then the kind of 3 that you're going to come across most often are consent, legitimate interest, and contract. To break it down really simply as I can without being overly simple, which is a fine line. Contract is if you need to process that data to achieve a contract. And that doesn't mean a formal signed contract. That could just be selling a t-shirt. Like I have to give you my address if you're going to post you're going to post the t-shirt. So for your side of the contract, which is to give me the t-shirt, you have to process that data. So most of the time when you're looking at purchases, contract is going to come into play. Legitimate interest is where you have a good reason, a good legitimate interest, and it literally means a legitimate interest to process that data. So that might be a business interest. It's in our business interest to process this data for X reason. With that one, you do have to justify it, and you may be asked to prove that you've justified it. And there's a 3-part balance test, which is that there's a good purpose. You absolutely do need to do it, and there's a good necessity. That you have looked at kind of other options. Is it absolutely necessary to do it this way? Is there another option? And you've balanced it, which is that it's doesn't infringe upon people's rights more than it benefits you. So there's that kind of test for it. But in a lot of cases, you can rely on legitimate interests to process data. Very good in an employment context, for example. Processing my staff's data on legitimate interest and things like that. The final one is consent. Consent gives someone absolute control of their personal data, and it's often not very good. It's not very useful because it has to be freely given, informed, and specific. It cannot be freely given, for example, if I'm your employer, because of an imbalance of power. So, for example, public authorities can't use consent because there's an imbalance of power. They're a public authority, you're an individual. So often it's not freely given. And additionally, it can't be a barrier to service. So if the person doesn't consent, you can't stop them from using your services just because they don't consent to their personal data. So we take the example of the t-shirt. If you're relying on consent there, I am legitimately able to say, I don't consent for you to process my personal data. And then you would say to me, well, then I can't send you the t-shirt. You would be in the wrong in that example because you have to send me the t-shirt. You can't use consent as a barrier to service. So you can't rely on consent in that example. So often consent isn't the most useful. But again, if you do want to give people complete control of the data, you can rely on consent. You're welcome to. It's a good kind of brand option for you to do so. But be mindful, if they do withdraw the consent, you would have to delete the data, and you cannot change the purpose. You can't suddenly say, oh, it was consent, but now you've asked for us to delete it. We're actually going to consider it's going to be something else. Only final thing I would add to that is there is an additional category called special category data. And to be frank, that's data that could screw someone over if it was released. So it's like political, philosophical beliefs, sex life, trade union membership, things like that, which is interesting because it could screw someone over if you told that to someone. That data, you require an additional reason to process it. You can't just have one, you have to have two. And that's a separate list of reasons. And that's more detailed, more complicated. But there is just a special mention of special categories. If you're processing things about people's health or sex life or trade union membership or their philosophical beliefs, religion, ethnicity, things like that, be mindful because you will need an additional reason. And that's set out in a different section of the GDPR. And there's about, I don't know, so like A to J or something, different reasons you can do that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. This is very helpful. Can we talk a little bit more about consent? So you mentioned that consent cannot be a barrier to a service. Mm-hmm. Can it be a barrier, however, to a small discount, for example, in the sense that can you offer a discount as an incentive to consent to marketing? So if somebody doesn't consent, you still provide the service, but if you do consent to marketing, then you get something.
I would strongly advise not to, because I would argue it's not freely given in that sense. You're kind of bribing someone to do it. So is it really freely given? I'd be very cautious about doing that. With everything in data protection, it's about balancing risk, and you may choose to risk to do that anyway. I'm not really here to judge you on the rights and wrongs. I can just advise you about the risks. I would say that's quite risky, because I would say it's probably not freely given in that sense. But yeah, I mean, if we really wanted to do it, we could do our best to make it work. But yeah, I'd be cautious.
All right, got it. So we talked a little bit about UK GDPR and EU GDPR already. Can we talk about it a little bit more? So how has Brexit affected GDPR, and how has UK GDPR diverged from EU GDPR so far. And you kind of mentioned already that there may be plans to diverge even more in the future. So what's the situation there?
Yes. So there are two at the moment. There's UK GDPR. Well, technically, in case there are any Europeans on here that are particularly sensitive to this, there is the GDPR and the UK GDPR. I've had some colleagues get upset when I've called it the EU GDPR for some reason. I don't know. But anyway, there are two. Currently, the difference is one says UK and one says GDPR. That's the difference at the moment in terms of that. There's always been a difference because in the UK we have the Data Protection Act 2018. In France, you have the Data Protection Act 2018. In Germany, and that has some specifics about UK law. So, for example, if you were to do something illegal with personal data in the UK, you would be prosecuted under the Data Protection Act because that sets out the kind of how the UK would deal with that. So there's always been some differences, and that's fine. That's how it works. There's also been a difference in the interpretation of PECR, which is a really important one, particularly for guys on this business, people on this call. The UK doesn't consider work email addresses as personal. Well, no, they consider it personal data. They don't consider it covered by a PECR. So you, as a sales rep or something, can email work addresses as long as the person isn't self-employed or a partner. Strangely, if they're not one of those, you can email work addresses. Whereas in Germany, they're like any email address. Doesn't matter if it's work or personal. There's always been some nuances between the two. But largely speaking, the text of GDPR is identical, and the approach is currently identical, even if the regulation in the UK is a bit more laid back than it is in the EU, and the UK's regulator is a lot more willing to kind of work with businesses to find a solution before fining. However, yes, there are proposals to significantly change data protection in the UK. And they will have been announced in the news in the last few weeks, and a lot of you guys might have seen it. It's kind of part of the whole revisiting EU regulations post-Brexit kind of agenda of the government, and I expect that we will see some changes to GDPR, regardless of anything, because it's part of the kind of bonfire of EU regulations. It's going to happen. We're going to drop the name GDPR. That much I can guarantee. It's going to be called something else in a few years' time. What specifically will change? I would be cautious about reading too much into it. It's out for consultation at the moment. You can find it online, all the details, and if you really want to, you can go and respond and give your views and comments. But it's designed to cut out some of the things that the government sees as overbearing, such as the need to have a DPO and the need to maintain a records of your processing activities, and the need to carry out data protection impact assessments, and making some things around legitimate interest easier. So they want to create some categories where you don't have to do a test. You can just use legitimate interest without even worrying about it. Lots of those things are being proposed, but they're at consultation stage. So we have no idea what the reality is going to look like. My biggest worry about it, because I don't care whether they change the law or not. It's not my job to worry about that. It's about how do we apply it. We in the UK get rid of records of processing activities, but we've got EU customers, so we're going to have to keep one anyway. A lot of these things are not necessarily mindful of the fact that we're still going to have to do it because we serve the EU, and the EU are very hot on enforcing things. So I think is designed to cut down on compliant costs in the UK. I think it's going to add to them, because not only are you going to have the GDPR to comply with, you're going to have the UK's regulation to comply with, and you're also going to have to comply with an emerging privacy legislative environment in the US as well. So you're going to have multiple to comply with. So I wouldn't go as far as to say it's great news for business, because I don't think it's going to massively change a lot if you work with the EU and you work in a global market anyway. It might even add to your costs. But some of the changes are positive. Some of the things that they're talking about changing, I agree with. I think they make sense. So, some of the changes are positive, but maybe don't reflect the kind of global nature of a lot of people's work these days. So, we'll keep an eye on it. We'll see. But it's merely consultation at this point.
Great. It's good to know.
And the culture secretary was replaced like the day after the consultation came out. So we'll see.
Well, it's good to know that now is the time to participate in those consultations for those who wish to have an influence on it. So
And it's important for business voices to be heard in that. Don't leave that to the data protection activists, because you do have a range of zealots out there, let's call them that are like, nothing should be done with personal data ever. All businesses should never process personal data. You have that group, and they will be very keen to participate. It's important for business people like you guys to have your views heard as well. So don't kind of shy away from it because it's data protection. Let's leave it to those guys. If you've got views on how your life could be made easier by reducing some of these things, feel free to go and comment.
Yeah, great, thanks. I'd like to talk about data migration a little bit. So say that a company has obtained personal data. They have used consent as the legal basis for processing the data. Now they are migrating it to a different provider. Maybe now it will be stored in the US. Previously, it was stored in the EU. Is there a necessity to obtain new consent?
No.
Okay.
No, the consent was for the data to be processed, not the behind the scenes.
Okay.
You would arguably have to update your privacy notice and let people know that you've done it by saying, hey, we've updated our privacy notice, go and have a read. Because you should really be telling people what you're doing with their data. But you wouldn't need to go and say, hey, we're moving it to a new company, we need new consent. Because you're not, you couldn't afford to give customers that power over you wouldn't be able to do business, because then you'd be like, well, we have to work with 30 different companies because this person wants that company, this person wants that company. So no, from a kind of individual customer point of view, you wouldn't need new consent for that.
Excellent, thanks. Right, so let's talk a little bit about maybe specific cases. So there are CTOs of large companies and small companies here. Do you have specific advice to small ones versus large ones?
Yeah, always break it down to its principles, I would say. And that's one of the reasons we do it. So I talked earlier about those 7 kind of foundations, those 7 pillars, and how they can help you be international. They can also help you with scaling. And I'll give a kind of specific example. If we take the first one, alphabetically the first, so it's always the first one I think about, access control. That is about making sure that the right people have access to the right things, the wrong people don't have access to the wrong things, and that people get access quickly and efficiently. And that's really important. It's not meant to be overbearing and difficult, because if they don't get it quickly and efficiently, I guarantee they're going to find workarounds. They're going to be sharing passwords and stuff like that. So part of the interest is to get it quickly and efficiently. That applies whether you're a 3-person company or a 4 million person company. That general principle applies. So as long as you have a way of managing that and understanding it, it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it achieves those outcomes. So with all of those 7 foundations, if you break it down to those and you make sure you're doing those things, how you do it can then be up to you guys as CTOs and things that are going to work for your company. So some companies might choose to adopt a access control software. It's going to cost you money, but you could do it. Some people could manage it all on a spreadsheet. And it's also going to cost you money because it's going to cost you staff time, but it might be manageable for you as a smaller company. It doesn't really matter. What matters is you're achieving those outcomes. So, when we work with a big range of company sizes, access control still applies, and we will help those companies find the best way of managing it for them, and support them in achieving the kind of the goal of the principle rather than the specifics of it. So, yeah, in the same way you'd internationalize by breaking it down to its foundations, you scale by breaking it down to its foundations as well. And if you want to use a spreadsheet or a £5 million system to manage access control, as long as it's achieving those principles, you're doing the right thing.
Excellent, thanks. So I would like to now talk a little bit about data breaches. So say that something happens, data has been leaked. What should a company do now?
First thing is don't panic. That's my first bit of advice. I think sometimes people panic about these things. What should you do in the data breach? Well, first of all, find out what happened. And that's why you shouldn't panic. Find out as much as you can about what's happening. If it's ongoing, stop it. Basically, if it's an ongoing thing, do your best to stop it. Once you have kind of control of the situation and you've stopped it from happening, it's like happened once or whatever, there's a few things to consider. Firstly, consider that you may need to tell the ICO. And if you do need to tell the ICO, you've got 72 hours to do it in. And it doesn't stop for Christmas. It doesn't stop for New Year. It doesn't stop for Easter. 72 hours will tick on anyway. And that's if the breaches results in a high risk to individuals. And how you're going to figure that out is by doing an analysis of what happened. So you'll want to have some kind of way of understanding what happened, what's the risks involved, what data was it, how big a deal is this? To give a really practical example, and these are 2 real life examples that I've dealt with. One was an example of a GP surgery. They're both GP surgeries. One shared GP surgery with someone else. And when you put the kind of first initials of someone's name, their name and address came up, kind of as a drop down. Well, they found out that the other surgery could see that. So they could see the name and address when they did it. So it's name and address, right? However, they're all governed by NHS guidelines. They're all governed. They've all been given data protection training. They're doctors. It's not a big deal. So it was kind of seen as a minor thing, and we don't need to do much apart from fix the flaw in the system. It's fixed. We can move on. The exact same data, name and address, in a different scenario, someone called up a GP surgery and said, I'm just looking to check if my wife's name and address is correct. And they said, oh, okay, yes, it's Mrs. So-and-so, and her address is blah, 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 blah. Same data, name and address. This guy was the estranged husband who was currently under investigation for domestic abuse, and the GP surgery had given the name and address of that woman out to the person. Both of those examples of name and address, one is a significantly bigger problem than the other. So you always need to think about the context of the data that you've given, not just the data itself, but how is this going to impact individuals? So think about those things, try and stop it. Think about whether you need to tell the individuals, think about whether you need to tell the ICO. Be mindful of telling individuals, because some individuals, if you tell them there's been a data breach, they'll change their name, they'll change their address, they'll change their credit card, they'll flee to Peru and they'll never be heard of again because they're like, oh my God, there's a data breach, when actually it could be, oh, we just sent your email to the wrong person. So you don't always have to tell people. You only have to tell people if there's a high risk to their rights and freedoms. So not in every case. So there's examples where you tell the ICO, but you wouldn't tell the people, which is an interesting one. And then finally, most importantly, do some lessons learned. Learn something from it and write it down. Like I said, if that comes back to you in 6 to 9 months, the ICO is going to say, what happened and what did you do? Keep a record of it and make sure you keep a record of something you've learned from it, because that's going to be so important in pacifying the ICO when they come to you and say, what happened? You can say, this happened, but look, we changed our system. We rectified it. We did a review. We got more training. That's going to put you in a much stronger position. So that's kind of basic guide to data breaches. Oh, I've lost you. I can't hear you.
Sorry for this, I was on mute. This was great, by the way, thanks. I have a few questions now in the Ask a Question section. Mm-hmm. Mark is asking if you could summarize those 7 pillars in text, email. Do you have a website where you have described them? If people wanted to access that information by text somehow?
Yeah, so we are going to do a write-up of the questions and things that we've asked and share that with CTO Craft afterwards. And that is, yeah, absolutely something we can capture in there. We can explain the kind of brief summary of those 7 pillars, definitely. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.
Excellent, fantastic. Also, another question from Mark. Mark is writing that there are 2 types of data protection. One is for internal IT infrastructure, like laptops, email, office apps, and one is for product security. Both are similar, but different. And I normally see the internal as CIO/IT, manager responsibility, and product as CTOs. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I see where that's coming from. And I think I wouldn't say that there's 2 types. I think there's one data protection and it's shared by multiple people with multiple angles. And that is very much what I was saying earlier about how important it is to have that culture and have it across the business and it not just be the sole responsibility of a CTO. My worry about kind of breaking it down into you're a CIO, so this is for you, you're a CTO, this is for you, is it's not going to help that kind of shared accountability, shared culture, and you're going to have kind of a siloed approach to it. I would definitely say, however, that the approach and responsibilities will be different, and there'll be different concerns and different things to do. And I agree with that, and I think that's why it's really important to build that overall culture of data protection, where the CTO plays an important a role in supporting data protection, but not the primary role, not the only role. So I agree on that sense. Yes, your CTO shouldn't be made responsible for everything to do with data protection. It's never going to work, and we see it.
Great. So we have a question from Jens here. Are these the same as the 7 pillars of data protection? Well, we'll have to check that link to see.
7 principles of the GDPR are the principles of which you have to apply with. So they're not the same thing because it won't tell you how to do it. 7 principles are things like lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. So that's not really a pillar of how to approach it. We've broken down into different pillars. So yes, they're good to know. They're definitely things to think about, but they are defined in the GDPR. So the GDPR talks about those 7 pillars, those 7 principles. And that underpins all data protection legislation, basically. What our 7 foundations, our 7 pillars that we described is actually how to manage data protection. So not what the law says, but how do you do it practically on a day-to-day basis. So it's different, yeah.
And if I understand correctly, those 7 pillars are your original work, original creation.
Yeah, we pull them together at Trust Keith, yeah.
Got it. Excellent. I have another comment from here. This is a really interesting session. I'm happy to be here. Happy to have you here as well. Do we have any set of detailed guidelines or any organization that combines all these different regulations and provides a list of actions you should take to be compliant with all of these? Well, that's definitely something that people ask us. They will be looking forward to what you write up after this session, Tom. Definitely.
Yeah, but again, I would say that would probably overcomplicate it. I think if you're looking at all the details of all the legislation, you're going to be overwhelmed. It's difficult to do that, and particularly as a CTO, kind of an understanding of all the various aspects is it's a lot more than kind of what your day job is about. And people like me do it full time, so it's a lot to kind of think about. And again, I think that's why the 7 pillars are so important to kind of bring it back to. And as long as you're doing those things, you're going to be okay. And I think it's a good idea to kind of have someone you could ask, or someone who's going to keep you up to date within your organization or externally with changes or anything specific. But generally, you can break it down into those 7 pillars.
Okay, great, excellent. Another question from Martin, and this is about soft opt-in / marketing without explicit consent. You did speak about it. For potential customers who create an account, thereby providing some personal details like email, but don't complete a sale, can the product still be marketed to them, i.e. emails, as long as there is an unsubscribe link on the email? So in this case, no opt-in or opt-out checkbox is ever displayed to customer, only unsubscribe link on email.
You have to give someone an option to opt out at the moment you collect their details. So technically, no, because you would have to give that option in order to meet those three pillars. Sorry, I keep saying pillars. 3, what would you call them? 3 criteria. So yeah, you would have to kind of get that detail at the point of sale. However, it raises a good point. What is a sale, and what is that defined as? Yeah, that is in the negotiation of a sale. So technically, even if someone sent an inquiry form into you saying, when is this product going to be live or whatever, that's in the negotiations of a sale. So you could, if you had an opt-out box in your inquiry form, market to them. So yeah, they don't actually have to buy it to be counted as being in a negotiation of a sale. So yeah. But yeah, you should get you should give the option to opt out when you collect the data.
Excellent, thanks. Sachin is asking, can you point to a blog or something that you may have written about the 7 pillars?
Yeah, that's something that we will, as I said earlier, we're going to pull together a write-up of this session, and we'll definitely include that. We're going to be sharing that with CTO Craft after the session. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. We will be sending it to everyone here.
Excellent. We just have a few minutes left, but I can see another question from Aravind. How does GDPR extend to corporate information?
GDPR covers personal information of natural persons. That's so it covers personal data. Personal data is identified or identifiable information about a natural person. For anyone who has any legal experience, you'll know what that means. Natural person means living. So if they're dead, it doesn't actually apply to them. So yeah, GDPR applies to identified information about living people. Therefore, if it's not about a living person, it's not covered by the GDPR. So if it's I don't know, what computer screens we use, it's not covered. It's not personal data. If it's who bought the computer screens, it is. If it's what do we use for Google Analytics, sorry, like what do we use for like cookies analytics? That's not personal data. It isn't. If it's the actual cookie identifiers, well, it's related to a identifiable person by that cookie identifier. Therefore, yes, it does apply. So yeah, as long as it's data related to an identified or identifiable person, GDPR applies. If it's not, then no, it doesn't apply.
Excellent, thanks. So we are nearing the end. Do you have any other advice for CTOs that I haven't asked about?
Yeah, if anyone ever comes to you and says, can you take on this entire GDPR process and own it all, push back. That would be my advice, and say, I'd love to, but I'd love to play a role in it rather than own it completely. We see this happen so often. It's just given to CTOs, oh, you're technical. All we need to do is just encrypt everything and we'll be fine. Yeah, great. It's encrypted, it doesn't count. Always remember it's that kind of cultural thing that you need to build in the business. And if you are a CTO in a tech business where kind of tech does run things and does rule things and can achieve that cultural change, you probably are a good person to do so. If you're a founder and CTO and you have that ability to really shift the culture and build this into day-to-day operations, then great, you're a really good fit for it. If, however, you're kind of mainly responsible for keeping systems and product running and all those kind of things, you're probably not going to be able to achieve that cultural change. And really, do you want the kind of responsibility on your shoulders if people are going to come to you and say, why wasn't this done? When it's not really kind of one person's sole ownership. So yeah, be mindful of cultural change. I know I keep coming back to that. But that's a mistake we see so often, is to just lump it with one person who doesn't have the time, energy, or resources to do it, therefore doesn't achieve it. And it becomes a worry and a concern, when really what we try to build across the businesses we work with is that shared culture of data protection, where the CTO plays a really vital and important role, but doesn't play the sole role in data protection. Okay,
great. This is great advice. We have one more question. We have to do this briefly as we're nearing the end. Is there a requirement to encrypt all personal information, or just protect it?
Just protect it. There's no requirement to encrypt it. Encryption is a good option. But yeah, there's no requirement to encrypt it necessarily.
Excellent. One last question. When I was reading your LinkedIn profile, I laughed when I saw somebody describing you as making data protection surprisingly enjoyable. So can you let us know how that came about? What's the story of that?
So I briefly, it's not available online at the moment, but I briefly ran a podcast called Gin and GDPR, where I combined Gin with GDPR. So I would talk about GDPR and how that applies kind of like in a realistic basis, and combine it with gin. And yeah, it's partially an excuse for some daytime drinking, but also I found it quite interesting. And I think that people were surprised about some of the things that GDPR actually covers, and some of the more interesting angles about it, and data protection and stuff like that. So I think they were slightly surprised to understand to find that GDPR it can be quite interesting, and there are things about it that are perhaps not as boring and legalistic, and it's not always a case of people like me saying, no, you mustn't do things. There are lots of things you can do and you should do. Yeah, I think that's where that came from.
Love it. Great. So how can people get hold of you?
Yeah, so obviously feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm down as Thomas Gell on LinkedIn. Yeah, reach out to me on there. I'd love to connect with people and kind of share experience and stuff like that. And additionally, you could, if anyone's got any kind of follow-up questions, we've got a question section on our website. It's www.trustkeith.co, so it's .co at the end. So if you go to www.trustkeith.co, you can get in touch with us there. And if you've got any questions or anything that we didn't answer today that you want to ask, there is an option to just ask the question on there as well. So yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn and visit us on our website.
Fantastic. Great. So thanks, Tom, for talking with us today. You can connect with the speaker after the event on the links I'm going to share now in the chat. And thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much.